So, I want to thank Kenny for bringing the stand. I think this is very helpful for anyone who needs to use notes. And also wanted to point out, I wanted to lift up Spence's community moment, because a lot of the points he makes, I think, will touch on my talk as well. And someone also asked, okay, what is a shibboleth? So, talk about kismet. So many things connecting here. So I'm going to go into the origin of the term. This is Bible story time, folks. In the book of Judges, there was a story about a conflict between two tribes of ancient Israel. The Gileadites were on the west side of the Jordan, and the Ephraimites were on the east side. And the Ephraimites were losing and trying to cross back into their own territory. And they had to figure out, if somebody crossed at a port in the Jordan, how do we make sure that it's not an Ephraimite trying to go back? Well, it turns out the Ephraimites spoke a particular dialect of Hebrew that did not have the sh sound, a voiceless paleo-alveolar sibilant, if you want to go into linguistics. So what they did is, whenever they found some poor little guy, and they thought he might be an Ephraimite, they would stop and say the word shibboleth. And if he said shibboleth, all right, off you go, because he was probably one of the Gileadites' allies who lived on the other side. But if he said sibboleth, because he couldn't say the sh sound, so what happened as a result later is that there was a basic meaning that came from the word shibboleth from this story. And it was a phrase or custom that is used to distinguish a particular group from the general population. Now there's a more extended meaning that has happened as a result, because we're not only talking about phrases and customs and particular modes of speech and so forth, but just to distinguish, but there's an added sort of value-laden approach. It's a belief, saying, or practice which is cited repetitively or unreflectively. That is, you just do it because it's out of habit, but which may be considered by others to be outmoded and or dubious. So I want to now go into some of the shibboleth for a very simplified parallel from psychology. Psychologists talk about an overvalued idea. That is an idea or concept that the person just almost obsesses about. This is something they have to do, or this is something which is very important. Only in this place, it's more collective. It's a particular religious group, a particular cultural group that holds on to this. And there are times when shibboleths overlap. So we have here the Amish with their hats and beards, and we have the Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox Jews, same habits. They're both borrowing from ideas in the Old Testament, and they just manage to converge in terms of manners of dress and appearance. Sometimes a shibboleth can become a common practice. This is a Quaker meeting. When the Quakers first formed, if you bought something from a merchant, you haggled over the price. And sometimes a merchant would actually up the price if they thought you were richer. The Quakers introduced the idea of fixed pricing for goods and services because it was simpler, it was more honest, it treated everyone the same, so it fit in with their core values, or testimonies as they call it. And the other way can happen as well. During the Middle Ages and well into the 18th century, women commonly wore and were expected to wear head coverings of some kind. It didn't have to be an elaborate wimple like this, but it was expected. It wasn't until late 18th or into the 19th century that it started to fade out, except for certain religious groups, and it's still retained in much of the Middle East among Muslim or Arab women. Now, what does this mean for a secular pluralist society? I boil it down to everyone is entitled to their shibboleths. Everyone is entitled to hold whatever idea they want of how to do things or how to say things or who to associate with, but you're not entitled to impose them on others. You can't infringe on the rights of others. You can't burden people by saying you have to follow my rule because I value it so much. Your shibboleth is for you and your group. It's not necessarily to be imposed on society. Examples of shibboleths that we entitle people to, we allow them to have. This is an actual officer in the U.S. Army who is also a member of the Sikh religion. In fact, he is a member of an inner group within it called the Khalsa, and he wears, as you see, a turban instead of a regulation army beret. The Army said this doesn't interfere with his duties, perfectly acceptable headgear, sure, go ahead and wear it, just make sure you wear the badge on it. And other groups have them and we allow. I work in a medical equipment office connected to a pharmacy, and we frequently see pharmacy techs who are studying from abroad and who wear the hijab. And it goes even further. The Pastafarians believe in wearing a colander on their head. All hail his newly goodness, Ramen. Medical practices. People are entitled, as adults, to accept or refuse any medical practice, like the Jehovah's Witness refusing blood transfusion. However, courts have said that since child welfare is a vital public interest, and since children are not capable of fully understanding and consenting to that, you cannot impose that on children. And JWs have raised a big hullabaloo about it. The compromise that has come up is that there are now synthetic blood products that can be used in transfusions. They're not used increasingly, I think mainly because of the expense compared to actual donation. But who knows what the future will hold. And then we now have the idea of homosexuality, and particularly same-gender marriage. You do not have to attend a gay marriage or a lesbian wedding. There's the old saying, if you don't like gay marriage, don't have one. If your church or synagogue or other religious community does not agree with it, they don't have to endorse it or have one held at their place of worship. However, in the secular realm, you're expected to at least respect the person. If you are not allowed, as a business owner, who provides public accommodation, to discriminate on the basis of the race of the couple, you cannot also discriminate on the basis of the gender. And it is especially true if you are a public official who is expected to treat everybody the same who comes in to get a marriage license. This has often been referred to as Kim Days' Sikh-Heil moment. I actually wrote several times that she clearly did not understand her job. A county clerk is not endorsing a marriage. They're simply saying that the people coming to apply meet the legal qualifications. That's it. They're making no judgments on whether they approve of the marriage. But she doesn't get that, and she decided to impose her shibboleth about homosexuality. Of course, a lot of people also brought up the fact that she's been divorced several times. She's married the same man twice, and she had children by one of her future husbands while she was married to someone else. But that went further into a much more, I think, logical questioning, which is, if you're going to allow business owners and public officials to not participate in it because of their sincerely held religious beliefs, are you going to hand out people a questionnaire saying, before I bake your cake or take your wedding pictures or arrange your floral decoration, please answer all these questions like, are you atheist? Are any of you divorced and remarrying? Did you have children out of wedlock? Are you deciding to be childless by choice, which if you believe that marriage is about procreation, and so on and so forth. And you can get into all sorts of ludicrous things where nobody is able to do business with anybody because somebody raises some sincerely held religious objection. The problem is that your religious beliefs or your philosophical beliefs or your political beliefs, there is a point at which you cannot expect the rest of the world to just conform to it. If you persuade other people to, just as the Quakers persuaded people that fixed prices for goods were more beneficial than having to haggle all the time, and in fact it was, as history has borne out, okay, you have persuaded people and you have changed the culture. But imposing that on the culture because you don't want to do something, that's something else. And so that's where I get into why is this questionable to call it a sincerely held religious belief. Well, first of all, you're cherry-picking one moral precept and making it a big deal, and all the others, well, okay, Kim Davis was divorced, but she's not perfect, she's forgiven. We hear that all the time. Well, then why aren't you imposing blocking people from remarrying if you hold that sincerely? They're calling for tolerance, but only in one direction. Why is it that we have to tolerate you, but you're not able to tolerate the couple who just wants to marry, get the legal benefits that you take for granted, and live their life without bothering anybody? Why must one group be tolerated for their intolerance? And also, what they don't realize is that their own communities are often divided on the issue. Moderate evangelicals are actually taking the view of, okay, we're not going to sanction same-gender marriages, but in the secular realm, the law says that they have to be treated equally, so we respect that and we will abide by that. And more progressive evangelicals are now rethinking their stand on LGBT issues, including whether churches should affirm same-gender marriages in their churches. So you can't say that this is, a Christian value when Christians themselves are now beginning to debate it more and more. So this is where I think we need to distinguish whether something is really about. It may be your personal value. You may sincerely believe that. But is that sufficient to say that the rest of the world now has to conform? Now, they would argue in the reverse and say, well, wait a minute. 20, 30 years ago, nobody would respect a same-gender couple coming up and getting a marriage license. That's true, and the law was abided. Gradually over time, what happened is attitudes changed, and just like with the Quakers with their idea of fixed prices, people took that shibboleth, or that minority view, and it became the common practice. So what is the antidote, I think, for this dispute that we have between people's shibboleths and more commonly held views? I think we really have to discern down to core values. Now, we have our 5 core value statements. When I think of core values, I really boil it down to like single words, like compassion, thinking, fairness is a big one for me. Asking Kim Davis, would you want a county clerk to refuse to give you a marriage license because you've been married 3 times? Oh, you've met your quota, sorry, can't have it. We have to recognize that we live in a pluralistic society, and that doesn't just mean that your group gets to do what they want, but that we have to coexist with each other and make some compromises. Now that's going to be very hard. One of the things that I read in a comment was somebody saying, gay marriage is not the end of the world. Well, according to Kim Davis and many people like it, it is the end of the world. It's a sign of the end times, and they have to stand by it in order to get into heaven. That's going to be kind of embarrassing for them when 30 years later the world hasn't ended. But that's not something that we can really argue about. The best that we can do is say, okay, you've made your stand, you've made your point, but you have to, you have to live in a society. Until the world actually ends, you have to live in a society with the rest of us. And third is, we have to be willing to test assumptions if we expect others to test their assumptions as well. You really have to, I think, a lot of times we get into very didactic statements. Just like when Spence was talking about people putting down people for saying, I'm praying for France, or I'm praying for the victims of this violence, and shooting off on that. You can either let it go out about affirmation of coexistence. They're entitled to say that, and it's not harming anybody. I love the Jefferson test that it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And you might, in an appropriate context, test someone's assumption, but you should also test your own assumption. Well, Does it really hurt anybody, and could it actually help? And if it can, let it go. I don't think that there's going to be a quick, easy fix to the problem of people trying to impose their shibboleths. The best that we can do is stick to our own values, including that all these different groups of which we live in society, we have to find a way to live together, and try to pose questions instead of dictating answers to people. That's the only solution. I know it's an incomplete one, but I now open to discussion for people.
With just playing on the example of Kim Davis, if the denial of the license is considered a shibboleth as opposed to a value, is it only a shibboleth if she is using it to signal, which it is arguable that she was doing, she was using it to signal her membership in one particular group, in-group status, to other evangelicals, or other conservative evangelicals? Or is it not also accurate to say it is a value, it is simply one that it is likely most people in this room disagree with? That she does hold values, and is there a meaningful distinction to be drawn in that case between values and the signaling of them? And is it not even slightly denigrating to reduce them to, well, this is just cultural signaling? And the fact that, yes, she has values that are different from ours, but in a pluralistic society that's going to happen. It's the imposition thereof which is problematic.
The imposition is the issue, is that if she were the usher at her church, and a same-gender couple decided to walk hand in hand into the church, and the rules of the church said, we don't tolerate this, okay, that group has that right. But when she took an oath to in the larger secular realm, engage in the occupation of county clerk, to say that her private membership and the beliefs of that membership trump that, basically what happens is that splinters the larger community. Okay, and I believe it was for her, she was trying to essentially identify herself and say, I am a Christian. She made that point several times. When she was asked after the court order, under whose authority she was denying, she was saying, under God's authority. And there would be a lot of Christians and others who would say, well, my understanding of God's authority is that you love your neighbor as yourself, and you let them show that love as they see fit. But again, there's also the thing, I've made the point that the job of a county clerk, when they're issuing a license and certifying a license, is to say, these people meet the legal requirements. That's all. They don't have to say that they like the marriage. If the guy shows up drunk and the woman is cowering like this, well, if they still meet the legal requirements and they're fully consenting, you're obligated to issue the license, whether you approve of that coupling or not. And that's the only job that she had. She misinterpreted it as that she was somehow part of that marriage, that she was somehow taking part in sanctioning that marriage. No, she was just saying they meet the legal requirements, period. And so I think it was that she was trying to have her, have that belief trump her duty, her sworn duty as a county clerk, and she was making it very clear it was to identify as an apostolic Christian.
I don't disagree with any of that. I think what I find problematic is the distinction between values, which are a thing, which she does have, even when they are in conflict, and I think the term shibboleth is almost misleading because it's saying that no, these aren't values that she has, just because they're not values that we hold, and that I find that distinction problematic.
I think one could see shibboleth as a subset of values. The question is, are we talking about commonly held values, commonly accepted practices, or are we talking about these are my distinct values and everyone has to make room for me to practice them wherever I am, as opposed to I can practice these in my house of worship, I can practice these at home.
So it's a question of privileging the values of an in-group. Okay, that I'm good to go.
You said at one point you're not sure how to sort of keep people from imposing their shibboleths. You don't have a good answer to that. And I think it's interesting that there's almost a self-correcting effect that has occurred since the issue with Kim Davis, in that, as you said, a lot of organizations are now rethinking their positioning because it's become such a hot topic and it's been elevated. And I think that I saw a study that the population has skewed even more towards seeing that you cannot elevate and privilege those religious impositions above an actual government official's job, including within religious groups saying, no, she was wrong. And I think that the very fact that this has tried to be imposed has actually reinforced that people think you can't impose these things. And I think that's an interesting aspect to see, that it sort of damaged its own attempt by trying to impose it.
I think also the public discourse has gotten back to the idea of core values. Mm-hmm. So for example, a lot of the Christians, they go into the core, so say, you judge everything, every rule, and every precept and so forth according to the great commandment, which includes love thy neighbor as thyself. And as a stance of that, you know, a lot of gay and lesbian, bisexual and transgender Christians have been re-examining the Bible, going back to the original language and coming up with their own hermeneutic, their own interpretation of it. And a lot of progressive evangelicals are now starting to listen to it. I think the entire public discourse that has been going on for decades before this happened has led to a lot of younger generation progressive evangelicals to question this unreflective homosexuality is bad dictate and say, wait a minute, does this fit in with the great commandment? Does this fit in with the ethic of love? We were wrong before about slavery. We were wrong before about women's rights. Could we be wrong about this? And if so, how do we remedy it?
To follow up on that, I think it's an interesting comparison over to determinations within the court system that some law is unconstitutional, in a sense that if sort of the great command is love thy neighbor as thyself, anything that was created afterwards, if it conflicts with love thy neighbor as thyself, it becomes effectively counter to the overarching principles. And I think that examination within religious institutions, the fact that it's occurring, is a good sign.
Sorry.
I wonder if there's thinking back to one of the slides you showed with the hats and the beards example, that there's, and I can't off the top of my head because of context and the topics that I read about, I can't think of anything non-religious off the top of my head, but there have been a lot of examples where people of very different religious backgrounds like stipulate to the same thing that means two different things to two different people, but there's like the social lubricant function of like, because we've both agreed to the same shibboleth or like test, we'll just say that we agree on this word while retaining like totally separate definitions of what we mean by, one nation under God, for instance. And so I was curious if there's like some, maybe like opportunity as well for groups by having something more superficial instead of a substantial value. Like if it's sometimes allows us to get along rather than to have the argument. Like it's sort of like a agreement to dodge the issue.
Or agreement to disagree?
Yeah.
Well, the closest that I could come to that fits with that is with the 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous. They're very focused on the higher power. But they also make it very clear, higher power as you conceive it. And it's even to the point that some people who are agnostic or non-theist, they imagine their higher power. One of them came up with a thing that, for him, GOD means group of drunks. So it was the group that was the higher power for him. So there's sort of the idea that some things are just left open-ended, let each individual interpret and leave it alone and so forth. But when you're talking about particular customs and so forth, to give you an idea, the Amish have actually splintered into many groups debating over things like what colors are permissible to wear and what are too gaudy, they're not plain enough, what colors are too proud. There was actually a split among Old Order Amish with one group saying that wearing two suspenders was proud, so they're the one suspender old order Amish. And goes on and on and on, because they're the agreements of rules that they come up with, which in their German dialect is called the Ordnung. Every single group has a different one, and they split off from each other because this group's Ordnung and that group's Ordnung have something which they can't agree on, so they don't fellowship at all. And it really gets to the point of, you know, nitpicking over things, at least from our perspective it is. But from their perspective, if their core value is to be plain and to not be proud, then it gets, you know, they say, how do they impose that core value onto various minutiae? And so it becomes problematic internally in the group, just as much as it becomes problematic with that group interacting with the rest of society. All right, once more.
I think there's an interesting question of how far the opposite should occur in terms of a secular society, sort of a common values perspective being therefore imposed even upon groups that have their own religious principles. For example, if we as a society say that it's not okay to have slavery, a religious group that says slavery is okay for us still should be like, no, no, no. As a society, slavery is not okay. You don't get an exemption from that just because you have this religious belief. And I think that since you brought up the Amish, there's a good question of when it comes to women's rights, because they have a very bad women's rights record, and they actually elevate male children above their mothers. And the pecking order in terms of society when it comes to eating food, it goes from the men eat first, then the boys, then the women, then girls. And that is one of those things where they're largely seen as sort of a small society that is sort of quaint in some ways, but the actual value systems that they hold have a lot of problems that if we actually considered how they connect to the larger community, the larger organization that they live within structurally as a society, there are things that we should be telling them that even though these are your religious beliefs, they do not hold underneath the overarching principles of the society you live in, even within your small group. That should not be acceptable. And sort of where that boundary is, because I personally think that there are a lot of things that are problematic like that.
There's also the question of what if the women who participate in that group accept that status, okay? So, you know, I am part of a sexual minority where there's frequently arrangements where one partner is considered the dominant and the other is the submissive, and it is negotiated consensually. Someone looking on the outside may look at that and say that it's being imposed, when in fact this is a role play that was negotiated, which they enjoy. It's also arguable, are they able to leave that group? Okay, the Amish have an incredible birth rate, and about almost half of their children decide not to stay in the community and to move on, usually either into a more assimilated, for lack of a better word, Mennonite community, or they just abandon religion altogether. And they learn to function in the larger society. Same with a lot of churches that will not allow women to be ministers, or in some cases not even vote in church. And the option then is, are you allowed to leave? If you have a group that not only impose that rules on their members, but will not let members leave, then you're dealing with a real problem, because then you're dealing with a real human rights problem of not allowing people the freedom to associate or disassociate.
I think part of the distinction I would draw in the case of Ari's question is, we can say this is not societally okay, but we can't say unless it actually is a legal problem, we can't say you need to stop how you are operating your religious community unless it is breaking laws. We can say that's not okay and boycott those Amish-made fireplaces that are sold on daytime TV and whatnot, but we can't impose secular values on a religious community as a religious community we can do so when providing public accommodations and when interacting with society at large. But all we can do is, by saying this is not societally okay, is saying I'm not going to do business with them. Just like we will when people say I'm not going to bake a cake or oddly sell pizzas to a gay wedding.
Which they never did before.
Which, yeah, anyone who thought that they were going to be delivering pizzas to a gay wedding has never met a gay couple. But anyway, and there's a boycott, and fantastic. But that's what we can do in that case. That's how those values, what we consider to be core American secular values, is through outside pressure, but not through outside enforcement, any more than we would want inside-out enforcement of their internal values and shibboleths and their internal rules.
That's a good point. In fact, you're talking really about a sort of a tension between different core values. We have a core value of equality, and fairness, of everyone being treated as they want to be treated more or less the same. But we also have a core value of respecting autonomy for individuals and for particular groups. So, yeah, we wouldn't want somebody coming in and saying we have to affirm a belief in God, or we have to accept certain people who want to do pagan rituals here, if that's not our identity, and if it makes people uncomfortable. Even if it did, to have government come in and say you have to do that would be a violation of that autonomy. I'm being buzzed on time, so one more question. No?
I will just say that I think my favorite example is just as we don't want the government going into an Orthodox Jewish synagogue and saying you must perform same-sex marriages, we don't want the Orthodox community saying women and men have to sit on different sides of this McDonald's or this courthouse or this bus, although they're doing that in New York City. But yeah, it's very much, it goes in both directions, and that's very important, I think, to point out.
Quick clarification. I was specifically talking in terms of groups where they are not allowed to, and that is an imposed situation that is perceived by those in that position as problematic, and they do not have an effective means of escape. So I guess this would be perhaps a larger issue in terms of the question of cults that are sort of restrictive or even to the point of abusive or controlling on behavior, and if there is some moral obligation as a society to at least recognize that there are rights being violated even within them once we learn that there are, and somehow intervene. Or if that's a question of, yes, but it's their religious beliefs, and if they're at least somehow justifying it, do we have the right to say anything?
And the more insular a group comes, and many groups which, as you described, are cultic and actually restrict people, the more insular they become, the less information the outside world gets about what's going on. So then it becomes a matter of, do you have the evidence under our rule of law to be able to get a warrant and go in and intervene? So it's always going to be an ongoing tension. I think we have to wrap it up.